Welcome back, everyone, to the Functional Longevity Podcast, where we give you insight on how to get fit, feel younger, live better. I'm your host, Chris Borda, best-selling author and owner of Y.E.S Fitness. Let me first thank you for taking the time from your busy day to listen to what I have to say. Before we also get started, let me thank our sponsor, Y.E.S Fitness. Most people lose the ability to enjoy life as they age. At Y.E.S Fitness, we help people age 40 plus get fit so they can live longer and enjoy those extra years doing the things they love to do. Some quick housekeeping here. You can get either a timestamp or a transcript of today's broadcast if you head on over to yesfitnessct.com. Across the top, you'll see a button for podcasts. Click on that, and that will give you access to one of our 386 episodes. You can also get this broadcast wherever podcasts can be found. Boost your longevity with particular supplements. I talk about this every time we get on a podcast because I think this is important. If you're training, eating well, and still dealing with low energy, brain fog, or stubborn blood sugar issues, that's usually not a motivation problem. It's a cellular one. As we age, mitochondrial function slows, metabolic control slip, and recovery takes longer. That's why I use Particular. There are NNM supports cellular energy reproduction, or production, I should say. Resveratrol helps protect heart and brain health, and berberine improves blood sugar control and metabolic flexibility, all critical for healthy aging after 40. These are clean, science-backed supplements made right here in the United States, and I've personally noticed a better energy, focus, and recovery. If you want your body to respond again, visit particular.com. That's particular.com and use the code YesFitness15 for 15% off. Protein and longevity, what the research really says. I'm talking about this because of those new dietary guidelines. Protein everywhere now on every commercial on all the products. And last week on the podcast, we talked about the new dietary guidelines. One thing that stood out immediately was that protein finally has a larger emphasis. And honestly, it's long overdue. But here's the issue. Even with that emphasis, protein is still confusing for a lot of people. People come in the gym, we talk about it, they don't actually even know what protein is. Some fear it, some avoid it. Others genuinely don't know how much they need or what good sources even look like. And that confusion matters because protein isn't a fitness trend. It's a foundational to how we age. Today, I want to clear the air. Not with extremes, not with dogma, but with evidence and real-world application, especially if your goal is functional longevity, living longer, and to be able to enjoy those extra years, because protein is still somehow controversial. The RDA problem. Minimum does not mean optimal. The current recommended daily allowance for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. That's about 0.36 grams per pound. So for a 180-pound adult, that's roughly 65 grams of protein per day. And here's the key point. That number represents the minimum needed to avoid deficiency, not the amount needed to build muscle, maintain strength, recover from training, or age well. A better name would be the minimal daily allowance. The RDA was created using nitrogen-based studies, asking whether the nitrogen going in the roughly equals the nitrogen going out. That method has serious flaws. Nitrogen losses through sweat, skin, feces, and breath are underestimated. They're underestimated. Urine collection is often incomplete. Food differ in nitrogen to protein ratios. And hitting zero balance tells us nothing about muscle function or recovery. Avoiding deficiency is not the same thing as optimizing health. More modern research methods point to a much higher intake. A realistic floor for most adults who want to maintain muscle, we always talk about how important muscle is, we want to maintain that, is 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day, what equals roughly 0.5 to 0.73 grams per pound of body weight. So for that same 180-pound person, that's 100 to 130 grams of protein per day. Not extreme, just appropriate. When I say numbers like that to people, they freak out. I can't eat that much. How do I get that much? That's crazy. But that's really what you need, especially as you age. And why protein becomes critical as we age. And here's a simple truth most people don't realize. We don't store protein. We store fat. We store carbohydrates as glycogen, but we don't store free amino acids. And when protein intake drops, the body pulls from the largest amino acid reservoir, skeletal muscles. So if you're not taking enough protein, that's where your body's going to pull from, muscle. That means inadequate protein immediately accelerates muscle breakdown. And with aging, muscle loss isn't just cosmetic. It affects strength, balance, bone density, insulin sensitivity, and independence. And it's just crazy. If you're not exercising, you're not lifting weights, and you're not getting enough protein, you're really doing yourself an injustice. Because research shows that adults consume about 50% more protein than the RDA experience less age-related muscle loss. So again, this is what the research shows. You've got to consume it. In older women, consuming roughly 1.2 grams per kilogram per day, about 0.55 grams per pound, are significantly less likely to become frail, which is what we do not want as we age. This is aging research, not bodybuilding research. Anabolic resistance and per meal protein. So as we age, our muscles become less sensitive to protein. This is called anabolic resistance. That means the same protein dose that worked at 30 doesn't stimulate muscle repair the way it does at 60. So 30 grams of protein at age 30 doesn't do what it does. Doesn't it do the same thing at age 60? Here's what the research shows. Younger adults maximize muscle protein synthesis at about 0.24 grams per kilogram per meal, which is roughly 0.11 grams per pound per meal. Older adults require close to 0.4 grams per kilogram per meal, or about 1.18 grams per meal per pound. So what does all that mean? For most adults, that translates to 30 to 40 grams of protein per meal eaten consistently across the day. That's what we need to do, 30 to 40 grams eaten consistently. If you eat like we eat, we suggest at Y.E.S Fitness, 5 meals a day, 5 times 30 would give you 150 grams. You'd be up over that 100 number pretty easily. And we know we need at least 150 grams because the body doesn't have the same response it did when we were younger. One protein-heavy dinner doesn't make up for protein-poor breakfast and lunches. Muscle protein synthesis is a repeated signal, and it needs to be triggered multiple times daily. Resistance training changes the whole equation. A huge part of what we call age-related muscle loss is actually inactivity-related. Resistance training restores muscle to the muscle's sensitivity to protein. When strength training is present, older adults respond more like younger adults at the same protein dose. So we don't need quite as much protein because we respond better if we're lifting weights. This is why protein and resistance training are inseparable when we talk about longevity. Muscle is a longevity organ. Protein without training underdelivers. Training without protein underperforms. Together, they protect function. Protein intake, strength, and real-world dosing here, okay? When we look at people who lift weights, higher protein intakes consistently lead to better outcomes. Moving from roughly 1.2 grams per kilogram to 1.6 grams per kilogram, that's 0.55 to 0.73 grams per pound, because Americans think about pound. Oh, this stuff is always in kilograms, but we do think about pounds, leads to greater increases in lean mass and strength. There is a point of diminishing return, but not a hard cutoff. And this is where real life matters. People don't eat perfectly every day. Aiming higher, close to 2.0 grams per kilogram per day, or about 0.9 grams per pound, creates a buffer. So if you weigh 100 pounds, you should be taking in about 90. A little safer. If you're 180 pounds, 150 pounds, we should be somewhere about 140. This kind of creates a buffer. So on imperfect days, we still land in an effective range. The downside of undershooting protein is far greater than the downside of slightly overshooting in healthy, active adults. So let's start addressing some of the common fears of having too much protein. Kidney health. In people without pre-existing kidney disease, higher protein intake does not and do not damage the kidneys. Changes in filtration markers reflect normal adaptations, not dysfunction. Even very high intakes in trained individuals show no adverse kidney or liver outcomes. Aging, mTOR, and cancer. Context changes everything. This is where the protein conversation usually goes off the rails. You'll hear something like protein activates mTOR, and I've talked about that. A few years ago, we talked about mTOR. mTOR drives growth. Growth accelerates aging and cancer. Therefore, high protein shortens lifespan. And like with a lot of things in this world, we need to change our opinion based on the science. It sounds logical, right? On the surface, we've talked about it before, but it collapses once you add context to it. Yes, protein activates mTOR. That part is true. But mTOR is not inherently bad. It's a nutrient sensing pathway that tells the body when to build, repair, and adapt. You don't want mTOR chronically elevated with no purpose, but you also don't want to permanently suppress it. If mTOR were universally harmful, growth, repair, wound healing, immune function, and muscle maintenance would all suffer. Aging well requires periods of growth signaling followed by periods of recovery, not permanent shutdown. And this is where lifestyle changes the entire equation. Protein does not act in isolation. One of the biggest mistakes in nutrition science is studying nutrients as they exit in a vacuum. Protein does not float through the body randomly, activating growth everywhere. What matters is where those amino acids are needed. A physically active individual, especially those performing resistance training, protein is rapidly directed towards muscle repair, mitochondrial remodeling, connective tissue maintenance, neural adaptation. In that context, mTOR activation is localized, transient, and purposeful. Contrast that with a sedentary individual consuming high protein without training. In that scenario, amino acids are less likely to be pulled into muscle tissue and more likely to remain circulating. That's where theoretical concerns arise, not from protein itself, but from low demand. This is a supply and demand problem, not a protein problem. Exercise changes how growth signals behave. Exercise fundamentally alters growth signaling in the body. Rather than increasing harmful exposure, regular training lowers baseline circulating IGF-1, increases binding proteins that limit free IGF-1 availability, redirects growth signals toward muscle and brain tissue, reduces chronic inflammation, and improves insulin sensitivity. In other words, exercise controls the direction and duration of growth signals. The body is amazing. You need to move and exercise. It's meant to do that. Protein plus inactivity is a very different biological environment than protein plus training. This is why discussions about mTOR, IGF-1, and cancer that ignore physical activity are incomplete at best and misleading at worst. So why lowering baseline circulating IGF matters? IGF-1's all over the place. Every other commercial, right? When people hear IGF-1, they often think more is better, especially with supplements and peptides being marketed as longevity hacks. That's an oversimplification. IGF-1 isn't inherently good or bad. What matters is how much is circulating freely and how long it stays elevated and where it acts. Lowering baseline circulating IGF-1 means that your body isn't sitting in a constant growth on state. That matters because chronically elevated IGF-1 encourages unnecessary cell proliferation, increases exposure to tissues, to growth signals when they're not needed, may increase risk in environments already stressed by inflammation, obesity, and insulin resistance. Lower baseline levels don't mean you can't grow or repair tissue. They mean growth happens when it's appropriate, not all the time. Think of it like this. You want surges of growth signaling after training, not a drip running all day long. Well, here's why is increasing IGF-1 binding proteins protective. Exercise doesn't just lower baseline IGF-1, it increases IGF binding proteins. These binding proteins act like traffic control. They reduce the amount of free active IGF-1 floating in circulation, limiting unintended signaling in tissues that don't need growth. Create a safer environment where IGF-1 is released locally, not system-wide. This is huge. Free IGF-1 is what interacts with cells. Bond IGF-1 is controlled, regulated, and context dependent. Exercise shifts IGF-1 from a broadcast signal to a targeted message. That's a big reason why people physically active don't show the same risk associated seen in sedentary populations, even when protein intake is higher. So why exercise redirects IGF-1 and where it actually helps. Exercise doesn't eliminate IGF-1. It redirects it. After training, IGF-1 is preferentially used for muscle repair and regeneration, tendon and connective tissue remodeling, brain health and neurogenesis. This is adaptive growth. Instead of floating around, potentially stimulating unwanted cell division, IGF-1 gets pulled into tissues that are actively repairing and adapting. This is a completely different biological scenario than trying to raise IGF-1 chronically through supplements without creating demand. So here's why supplements are missing the point. This is where the current IGF-1 supplement craze gets it wrong. Raising IGF-1 without training doesn't direct it to the muscles, doesn't improve function, doesn't mimic exercise signaling, and it may increase exposure without health. Supplements try to manipulate the signal. Exercise changes the entire signaling environment. That's the difference. You don't want high IGF-1 all the time. You may want IGF-1 to show up when it's needed, do its job, and then leave. The big picture takeaway here, okay? Lower baseline circulating IGF-1 equals unnecessary growth signaling. More binding proteins equal tighter control and safer delivery. Exercise equals precision targeting instead of system-wide exposure. Protein doesn't override the system. Inactivity does. When protein intake is paired with resistance training and movement, IGF-1 becomes a repair tool, not a risk factor. That's why chasing IGF-1 numbers without addressing training, sleep, and recovery completely misses the point. Longevity isn't about turning growth off. It's about using growth at the right time, in the right place, for the right reason. Animal studies don't translate cleanly to humans. We know this and understand this. Much of the fear around protein and longevity comes from animal studies where protein restriction extends lifespan. But those models exist in tightly controlled environments. No resistance training, no injuries, no sarcopenia-related falls, no loss of independence, no real stressors. Humans don't live in cages. In humans, the dominant predictors of morbidity and mortality are after midlife. So this is what happens. We have a loss of muscle mass unless we're doing strength training, a loss of strength unless we're doing strength training, loss of muscle and strength, get a loss of balance, and because of the loss of muscle, we have a loss of metabolic health. Protein restriction may extend lifespan in protected animals, but muscle preservation extends health span in humans. And health span, the years you can move, function, and live independently, is what most people actually care about. If protein driven growth were dangerous, athletes would be the canary in the coal mine. Excuse me. Here's a practical reality check. Athletes eat more protein, activate mTOR frequently through training, maintain healthy, higher lean mass across lifespan. If that combination were inherently dangerous, we'd expect athletes to live shorter lives. We see the opposite. Across multiple population, athletes, especially those who train consistently over decades, tend to live longer with lower rates of cardiovascular disease and many cancers. That doesn't prove protein is magic, but it strongly suggests that protein-driven growth signals, when paired with physical activity, is not a longevity liability. The real risk factor isn't protein, it's inactivity. Inactivity. The real danger isn't eating protein. The danger is eating protein without using it. When protein intake is paired with resistance training, adequate recovery, good sleep, a diet rich in fibers, fruits, and vegetables, growth signaling becomes adaptive, not pathological. Trying to suppress mTOR chronically in the name of longevity ignores the reality that aging itself is a catabolic state. Without sufficient anabolic signals, the body deteriorates. Longevity isn't about avoiding growth. It's about strategically using it. Functional longevity requires balance, not restriction. Could eating excessive protein in a sedentary, inflammatory, overfed state be problematic? Possibly. But it's not a protein issue. It's a lifestyle issue. For active adults who train, move, and recover well, high protein intake supports muscle preservation, metabolic health, injury resilience, and functional independence. Suppressing protein to chase theoretical longevity benefits while sacrificing strength and function is a bad trade. Longevity without capability isn't a win. So the bottom line, protein does activate growth pathways. Exercise directs those pathways towards repair instead of risk. Inactivity is what turns growth signals into a liability. If your goal is functional longevity, staying strong, capable, independent, protein is not the enemy. Misapplied biology is. So my final thoughts. This isn't about eating unlimited protein. It's about eating enough protein to protect muscle while still leaving room for fiber, fruits and vegetables, healthy fats. Protein is not the enemy of longevity. Muscle loss is. If you eat multiple protein-rich meals daily, train consistently, and choose quality sources, you don't need to obsess over numbers. You'll stay stronger longer, and that's functional longevity. So hopefully that clears up some of the problems that we have and misconceptions about protein. Get your protein in, maintain that muscle mass, maintain your metabolism, all the good things that protein do for you, and you will live a longer, healthier, more functional life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week with more information on how to get fit, feel younger, and live better.